Witold Pilecki was a man who became a symbol of unparalleled courage and sacrifice, but his story is one that remains largely unknown to many. His decision to volunteer for Auschwitz, a decision that would shape the course of his life and leave a mark on history, was not driven by a desire for fame or recognition. Instead, it was a deep sense of duty and moral responsibility that led him to undertake one of the most dangerous and selfless missions ever conceived during World War II. Born in 1901 in the Russian Empire, in what is now modern-day Poland, Pilecki's early life was shaped by the turbulent political and social climate of Eastern Europe. His family was deeply patriotic, and from a young age, Pilecki was taught the values of honor, duty, and loyalty to his country. These early lessons would stay with him throughout his life, shaping his worldview and actions. After his education in Poland, Pilecki joined the Polish army, where he quickly rose through the ranks. However, it wasn't just his military career that defined him. It was his extraordinary sense of responsibility to fight for the freedom and dignity of others that set him apart. In 1939, as Europe descended into chaos with the outbreak of World War II, Poland found itself caught between two formidable enemies, Nazi Germany to the west and the Soviet Union to the east. The invasion by Nazi forces on September 1st, 1939, led to the swift collapse of the Polish state, and the country was partitioned between Germany and the Soviet Union. The brutality of the German occupation, particularly the ruthless repression of the Polish people and the establishment of death camps, became a terrifying reality for those living under Nazi rule. Among the many horrific aspects of the German occupation was the establishment of Auschwitz, a concentration camp that would later gain infamy as the site of some of the most grotesque atrocities in human history. It was within this context that Pilecki's extraordinary mission began. The Polish resistance movement, recognizing the gravity of the situation, sought ways to gather intelligence on the growing power of the Nazi war machine. The sheer scale of the Nazi operations, particularly the systemic extermination of Jews, Romani people, and other groups deemed undesirable by the Nazis, required not only resistance efforts within Poland, but a strategic effort to understand and expose the full scope of the Nazi regime's horrors. The resistance needed a man who was not only brave, but capable of gathering crucial intelligence from within the heart of the Nazi machine. At the time, Auschwitz was a relatively unknown facility, even within the resistance. It was a place where prisoners were being sent, but its true purpose was not widely known outside of those involved in the Nazis' genocidal activities. The Polish resistance understood that in order to expose what was happening in Auschwitz and to undermine the Nazis' efforts, they needed someone who could infiltrate the camp and report back. This was where Pilecki's extraordinary decision came into play. With the support of the resistance, Pilecki volunteered for the mission to infiltrate Auschwitz. In a world where most would have considered such an action to be an act of sheer madness, Pilecki embraced it as a moral imperative. His decision to enter Auschwitz was driven by a combination of patriotism, duty, and a profound sense of responsibility to protect the lives of others. He knew that the camp was a place where few would survive, and the odds of returning alive were slim. But Pilecki's sense of duty far outweighed any fear he may have had. He did not enter Auschwitz as a prisoner by accident. He allowed himself to be arrested by the Gestapo and sent to the camp under the pretense of being a criminal. Once inside, he would use his position to gather intelligence, form resistance cells, and help those who were suffering under the Nazis' brutal regime. It was a mission that required immense courage, fortitude, and a level of sacrifice that few can even comprehend. For Pilecki, the objective was clear: expose the truth about the atrocities taking place within the camp and do everything in his power to undermine the Nazi regime from within. The conditions inside Auschwitz were unimaginable. Pilecki faced not only the brutalities of forced labor and starvation, but also the ever-present threat of death. His role as a prisoner gave him access to the inner workings of the camp, and he used this position to observe the atrocities being committed. He formed alliances with fellow prisoners and began gathering vital intelligence. Over time, he established an underground network within the camp, organizing resistance efforts that would later prove invaluable to the broader struggle against the Nazis. Pilecki's mission was one of incredible selflessness. While many would have focused on their own survival in such a perilous environment, he remained focused on his mission to expose the truth and help those around him. His efforts to build a resistance movement within Auschwitz were critical. These underground cells provided prisoners with some hope and a sense of agency, however small. The network also provided the Allies with critical intelligence about the scale and nature of the genocide occurring at the camp. In some ways, Pilecki's presence in Auschwitz was a microcosm of the larger resistance movement in occupied Europe, a group of individuals willing to risk everything for a chance to make a difference. Despite the overwhelming odds, Pilecki maintained his resolve. He witnessed the systematic murder of thousands, the torture of fellow prisoners, and the cruelty of the Nazi regime. But even in the face of unimaginable suffering, Pilecki remained steadfast in his belief that the truth needed to be revealed. He was not only a witness to the horrors, he was an active participant in trying to stop them, working from within the camp's walls to weaken the Nazi war machine. The world outside Auschwitz remained largely unaware of the true scale of what was happening inside. Although the Polish resistance had a vague understanding of the atrocities taking place, they lacked concrete evidence that could be used to rally international support. Pilecki's reports were vital in providing this evidence. He sent numerous reports to the Polish government in exile, detailing the conditions within the camp, the systematic extermination of Jews, and the forced labor operations. These reports were critical in helping the Allies understand the full extent of the Holocaust, though much of the world would remain in denial about it for years to come. After 2.5 years of living in hell, Pilecki was eventually able to escape from Auschwitz in 1943. He had succeeded in gathering vital intelligence and had helped build a network of resistance inside the camp. But his mission was far from over. His escape marked only the beginning of a new chapter in his life. He continued to fight for Poland's independence, but the legacy of Auschwitz would remain with him for the rest of his life. Witold Pilecki's story is one of exceptional courage, a commitment to moral responsibility, and a deep sense of duty to his fellow human beings. His actions, while largely unrecognized in the broader historical narrative for many years, were nothing short of heroic. He demonstrated that, even in the darkest of circumstances, a single individual can make a difference. His selflessness, bravery, and unwavering determination to expose the truth at all costs are what define him as one of the most extraordinary figures of World War II. Witold Pilecki's escape from Auschwitz was a feat that would have seemed impossible to most. Yet for him, it was simply another step in a mission he had set out to complete. His time in Auschwitz had been one of unimaginable hardship, but it had also been the crucible in which his resolve had been forged. By the time he managed to break free from the death camp in 1943, he had already spent over 2 years under the most brutal conditions imaginable. He had seen the depths of human cruelty and witnessed the systematic extermination of millions. But he had also seen the incredible strength of those who resisted and the spark of humanity that persisted even in the darkest places. Escape from Auschwitz, though, was not as simple as breaking free from captivity. It was the culmination of a series of carefully planned steps, each one requiring the utmost discretion, coordination, and bravery. Pilecki had always been a man of action, and he understood that his escape would not only mean survival for him, but also the continuation of his mission. If he was to succeed in warning the world about what was happening in Auschwitz, he would have to get out. But this was not a task that could be achieved through brute force. It required patience, meticulous planning, and a deep understanding of the Nazi regime's operations. Over the years, Pilecki had become intimately familiar with the inner workings of the camp. He had gained the trust of his fellow prisoners and had established a network of resistance within the camp's walls. This underground network had become a vital lifeline for the prisoners. It provided food, supplies, and information that allowed the prisoners to hold on to their dignity in the face of unspeakable horrors. The network also gathered vital intelligence, much of which had been passed to the Polish government in exile. But for Pilecki, his role was not only about resistance, it was also about survival. He knew that, without a plan for escape, all the work he had done to expose the atrocities of Auschwitz could be in vain. The escape plan was complex, and it involved a careful balance of secrecy and coordination. Pilecki's first priority was to ensure that the underground network within the camp remained intact. If he were to escape, he needed to make sure that the resistance would continue to operate in his absence. He worked tirelessly to train others to take his place and ensure that the flow of information to the outside world would continue. The Polish resistance was deeply invested in the intelligence Pilecki had gathered, and they knew that the camp's horrors needed to be exposed to the world. But Pilecki's commitment to the resistance effort went beyond mere intelligence gathering. He had come to see the prisoners of Auschwitz as his brothers and sisters. They were not just pawns in a larger political struggle. They were people, and they deserved every bit of the fight he could give them. As the months passed, the conditions within the camp became more dire. The Nazis had escalated their efforts to exterminate the Jewish population, and the brutality of the guards reached new levels of cruelty. The sheer scale of the atrocities being committed was staggering, and Pilecki knew that time was running out. He could not remain inside the camp forever. The world had to know what was happening, and it was his duty to make sure that the horrors of Auschwitz were revealed. In the spring of 1943, Pilecki finally saw his chance. He had been meticulously observing the movements of the guards and had studied the camp's routines in great detail. He knew the layout of the camp better than anyone, and he had come to understand the weaknesses in the Nazi security system. The escape would require careful timing, the right connections, and the ability to act quickly and decisively. In truth, there was little room for error. The risks were immense. If he were caught, the consequences would be unimaginable. But Pilecki was not a man easily deterred by fear. The plan began to take shape, and the first critical step was to secure the support of the right people. Pilecki had built a network of contacts both within the camp and outside of it. This network, made up of fellow prisoners, resistance members, and people sympathetic to the cause, would play a crucial role in the success of the escape. The key to escaping Auschwitz was not just getting out of the camp, but making it past the Nazi security forces who surrounded it. To do this, Pilecki would need help from the resistance on the outside. His comrades would have to create a diversion, one that would draw the attention of the Nazi forces away from his escape route. One of the biggest obstacles Pilecki faced was the fact that he had to escape while being closely monitored by the Nazis. The Gestapo had already arrested many of the prisoners who were suspected of being involved in the resistance, and they had ramped up their efforts to root out any remaining dissidents. Pilecki's every move was watched with suspicion. He knew that if he was caught planning his escape, it would mean certain death. Yet, despite the ever-present danger, Pilecki remained resolute. He spent his days working with the resistance cells, gathering intelligence, and helping others. All the while, he knew that the time for action was drawing closer. He could not afford to waste a single moment. Finally, the day came when Pilecki knew that the plan had to be put into motion. He made his decision, understanding fully that there was no turning back. The escape was set for the night of April 26, 1943. Pilecki knew that he would have to move quickly. He had arranged for a group of prisoners to help him during the escape. They would provide distractions and misdirection while Pilecki made his way out of the camp. He had arranged for a small opening in the camp's barbed wire fences to be widened just enough for him to slip through. The escape route was a narrow, treacherous path that wound its way through the surrounding forest. Once he made it past the fences, he would be free. But he had to get past the Nazi sentries first. In the dead of night, Pilecki and his companions put their plan into action. The camp was eerily quiet, with only the sound of distant screams and the occasional clank of a guard's boots on the gravel roads. Pilecki, along with his fellow escapees, moved through the darkness, careful not to make sound. Every step felt like a gamble. A single misstep could bring the entire plan crashing down. As they approached the opening in the fence, Pilecki's heart raced. He could hear the guard patrolling nearby, their footsteps growing louder with each passing second. The tension was palpable, but against all odds, the plan went off without a hitch. Pilecki slipped through the gap in the fence, and for the first time in over 2 years, he was free. The escape was not the end of Pilecki's journey, though. Once outside the camp, he still had to navigate the dangers of Nazi-occupied Poland. The risk of being captured was still very real. But Pilecki's determination to expose the truth of Auschwitz drove him forward. His escape from Auschwitz had been a testament to his incredible bravery, but it was only the beginning of the larger struggle that lay ahead. His mission was not over. After escaping Auschwitz, Witold Pilecki faced not just the physical dangers of Nazi-occupied Poland, but also the immense emotional and psychological toll of what he had witnessed inside the camp. His survival, while an incredible feat of endurance, was a bittersweet victory. It came with the heavy burden of knowing the full scope of the atrocities committed within the camp's walls, atrocities that had yet to be fully understood by the outside world. The information Pilecki had gathered over his years of imprisonment was invaluable, but the challenge now was to ensure that it would reach those who could act on it. The Allies needed to know the truth about Auschwitz, about the mass extermination taking place, and the world needed to understand that a genocide of unprecedented scale was unfolding right under their noses. Once free, Pilecki was quickly forced to transition from his role as a prisoner and resistance fighter to that of a crucial witness and intelligence officer. His immediate priority was to make contact with the Polish government in exile, which had already been receiving information from within Nazi-occupied Poland. But this was no simple task. The Nazis had a firm grip on the country, and Pilecki's escape from Auschwitz had not gone unnoticed. The Gestapo was tightening its net around any potential resistance fighters, and the risks of being captured were greater than ever. The first few days after his escape were marked by a series of rapid and desperate moves. Pilecki knew that he couldn't stay in one place for too long. He had no illusions about the level of surveillance the Nazis had in place to track down escapees from the camps. The Germans were notorious for their ruthless efficiency, and they would spare no effort to hunt down a man like him. So, he quickly took to the underground movement, relying on the resistance to hide him, move him, and provide him with the necessary resources to continue his journey. Despite the perilous situation, Pilecki remained focused. He had a singular objective: to deliver the reports he had written from inside Auschwitz to the Polish government in exile, and to make sure that the world understood the scope of the Holocaust. This task, however, was far from straightforward. The information he carried was a double-edged sword. It could save lives, but it could also make him a target for the Gestapo. The authorities would not take kindly to the fact that one of their former prisoners had successfully escaped, and his reports, detailing the systematic extermination of Jews, the conditions of forced labor, and the atrocities committed by the Nazis, were damning evidence of the brutality of the regime. In the eyes of the Germans, Pilecki was not just a resistance fighter. He was a threat to their entire operation. As he made his way through the Polish countryside, Pilecki relied on the network of contacts he had developed before his capture. The underground resistance had been essential to his survival inside Auschwitz, and now it was crucial to his freedom. They guided him through Nazi-occupied territory, ensuring that he was able to avoid the patrols and checkpoints that could spell disaster for him. But the journey was fraught with peril. Every encounter was a potential disaster, and Pilecki had to be cautious, careful, and unrelenting in his determination to complete his mission. One of the most difficult aspects of his journey was the emotional weight of his experiences in Auschwitz. He had seen things that no human being should ever have to witness: the brutality of the guards, the endless suffering of the prisoners, and the horrifying efficiency of the extermination process. But despite all of this, Pilecki never lost sight of his moral compass. His decision to enter Auschwitz had been born out of a sense of duty to protect the innocent, and this duty remained his guiding light, even in the darkest moments of his escape. Along the way, Pilecki met with various members of the Polish resistance, passing along critical intelligence about the Nazi regime's plans. He shared details about the construction of more death camps, the methods of extermination used in Auschwitz, and the growing scope of the Holocaust. His reports were comprehensive and detailed, and they painted a horrifying picture of the Nazi war machine in action. He also provided updates on the state of the resistance inside Auschwitz, detailing how the underground movement had operated and the challenges faced by those still imprisoned within the camp. But even as he continued his journey, Pilecki was aware of the fact that his story was only part of a much larger narrative. Auschwitz was not the only place where atrocities were taking place. The Nazis had set up extermination camps across Europe, and millions of Jews, Romani people, and others were being systematically murdered. It was a horrific reality, and Pilecki knew that the struggle to expose the truth would not end with the delivery of his reports. The war was far from over, and the road to victory would be long and difficult. The reports he carried could potentially save lives, but they could also be dismissed or ignored by the very people who could make a difference. In addition to his work with the Polish resistance, Pilecki sought to make contact with the Western Allies. He knew that it was not enough to alert the Polish government in exile to the horrors unfolding in Auschwitz. He needed to make sure that the Allied powers understood the full extent of the Nazis' genocidal campaign. He was determined to raise international awareness, hoping that the global response would put pressure on the Nazis to end the extermination campaign and stop the suffering. His efforts were met with mixed results. While the Polish government in exile took his reports seriously, the Western Allies were initially skeptical. The information Pilecki provided was so harrowing, so unbelievable, that many refused to believe it could be true. At that point in the war, the scale of the Holocaust had not yet been fully acknowledged by the world. The Nazis had become experts at obfuscation and deception, hiding their crimes behind a veil of bureaucracy and misinformation. Pilecki's reports, while groundbreaking, were not enough to shake the belief of many that the Nazis were still capable of denying the full scale of their crimes. Despite these setbacks, Pilecki remained committed to his cause. He understood that his mission had a dual purpose: to expose the truth and to encourage action. His courage and perseverance in the face of these obstacles were remarkable. He refused to let the world forget what had happened inside Auschwitz, and he was determined to ensure that the atrocities committed there were not erased from history. In the months that followed, Pilecki continued to work with the resistance, gathering more intelligence and coordinating with various factions to further the cause of Polish independence. But his heart and mind were never far from Auschwitz. The survivors of the camp, those who had been released or had escaped, were his constant concern. The work of rebuilding after the war would be a long and difficult process, and Pilecki knew that the emotional scars of Auschwitz would run deep. Yet, for all the pain he had endured, his greatest hope was that the world would learn from the horrors of the Holocaust, that the memory of Auschwitz would serve as a warning to future generations about the dangers of hatred and indifference. Witold Pilecki's journey was far from over. His escape from Auschwitz was only the beginning of a long and arduous path that would take him through the trials and tribulations of war, resistance, and survival. But through it all, Pilecki never wavered in his commitment to the truth. His dedication to his mission, his unwavering courage in the face of unimaginable horrors, and his deep sense of responsibility to the world are what make his story one of the most extraordinary and important chapters in the history of World War II. Witold Pilecki's escape from Auschwitz was not the end of his journey, but rather the beginning of a new phase in his relentless pursuit to expose the truth about the horrors he had witnessed. As he traversed the war-torn landscape of occupied Poland, he knew that the challenges ahead were enormous, and the obstacles in his path were just as daunting as those he had faced inside the death camp. The world had yet to fully grasp the scope of the Holocaust, and Pilecki's mission to bring the truth to light was fraught with danger, skepticism, and the ever-present threat of capture. Despite these risks, Pilecki's commitment to his cause was unshakable. He was determined to ensure that the atrocities committed by the Nazis would not be swept under the rug of history, and that the world would know what was happening in Auschwitz and the other death camps. After his escape, Pilecki was thrust back into the perilous underground world of the Polish resistance. Though he had escaped the clutches of the Nazis, he was not yet free. He was still in Nazi-occupied Poland, and the Gestapo's web of surveillance was pervasive. Pilecki's presence, now even more dangerous because of the intelligence he carried, made him a prime target for Nazi forces. His life remained on a knife's edge, and every step he took could have led to a betrayal or discovery. Yet, Pilecki remained resolute. He knew that the survival of the prisoners he had left behind in Auschwitz, and the knowledge of the atrocities committed there, depended on him. His immediate priority was to deliver the reports he had painstakingly written while inside the camp. These reports contained crucial information about the systematic killings in Auschwitz, the scale of the genocide, the methods employed by the Nazis to exterminate millions, and the conditions inside the camp. It was vital that this information reached the Polish government in exile and, ultimately, the Allied powers. But the task was far from simple. Pilecki had to navigate a labyrinth of dangers, both from the Nazi forces and from the very resistance networks that he had worked so hard to build. The route to freedom was fraught with obstacles, and the risk of discovery was high. At any moment, he could be captured, tortured, and killed. His every move had to be calculated, and his survival depended on the secrecy and efficiency of the underground network. To make contact with the Polish government in exile, Pilecki had to reach a part of the country not yet fully under German control. The logistics of such a journey were challenging, and he relied on the same networks of support that had helped him survive inside Auschwitz. The resistance movement was vast, but it was also fractured. There were various factions within the resistance, each with its own agenda, and Pilecki had to navigate this complex web of allegiances. His mission required him to meet with resistance leaders, provide them with the vital intelligence he had gathered, and ensure that the reports he carried reached the highest levels of authority. It was a task that demanded both courage and diplomacy. As he made his way through Poland, Pilecki had to rely on a series of safe houses and coded messages to avoid detection. The risks were not just physical. The psychological toll was immense. He had seen the worst that humanity had to offer within the confines of Auschwitz, and now he had to witness the ongoing suffering of the Polish people as they lived under the shadow of Nazi occupation. The resistance was fighting a desperate battle, but they were severely outmatched. The Nazi forces had overwhelming firepower and manpower, and the Polish resistance had to rely on guerrilla tactics and subterfuge to remain effective. The constant fear of betrayal, the shortage of supplies, and the brutal reprisals by the Germans all weighed heavily on Pilecki's mind. Throughout this period, Pilecki was constantly confronted by the contradictions of war and resistance. He had entered Auschwitz voluntarily to fight a war of resistance from within, and now, outside the camp, he was engaged in another type of struggle, one that required not just physical endurance, but intellectual agility. Pilecki had to convince others that the reports he carried were legitimate. Many in the resistance were initially skeptical. After all, the scale of the atrocities Pilecki was describing was so horrific that it was hard to believe. The idea of industrialized genocide was still a concept that many could not fully comprehend. And even when his reports were taken seriously, the question remained, what could be done about it? In the spring of 1943, Pilecki managed to make contact with the Polish government in exile, which had already been receiving reports about the mass killings happening in the Nazi death camps. He delivered the information that he had gathered while inside Auschwitz, as well as updates on the operations inside the camp. The reports included detailed descriptions of the methods used to murder Jews, Romani people, and other victims of the Holocaust. He described the gas chambers, the crematoria, and the mass executions. His first-hand testimony was unparalleled in its detail and accuracy. It was one of the most comprehensive accounts of the Holocaust to reach the Polish government in exile. But despite the urgency of his message, Pilecki was met with a mixed reception. While the Polish government in exile took his reports seriously, the Western Allies were far more hesitant. The news of the Holocaust was difficult to believe, and many were unwilling to accept the full extent of the Nazi regime's brutality. The idea that the Germans were systematically exterminating millions of people was a hard truth to swallow. There were also strategic considerations at play. The Allies were focused on winning the war, and many were hesitant to divert resources to a cause that seemed, at the time, to be secondary to the military objectives. The reports from Pilecki and the Polish government in exile were met with varying levels of disbelief indifference, or even denial. The silence and reluctance of the Allied powers to act on the information Pilecki provided only made the situation more dire. It was one thing for the Polish resistance to take the threat seriously. It was another for the international community to acknowledge the full scale of what was happening. The Allies had the power to end the suffering, but they had yet to realize the urgency of the situation. Pilecki's frustration with this inaction grew. He had risked everything to deliver this information, and the failure to act on it felt like a betrayal to the millions who were still trapped in the clutches of the Nazi death machine. His struggle was not just one of survival, but one of persistence, of never giving up, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. As Pilecki continued his work in the underground resistance, he became increasingly aware of the limits of his influence. The battle to liberate Poland was ongoing, and the Allies were slowly beginning to recognize the full scope of Nazi atrocities. But the war was far from over, and the ultimate fate of the Polish people remained uncertain. In addition to the Germans, the Soviet Union was also exerting pressure on Poland, and Pilecki knew that after the war, Poland would be caught in the crossfire between two occupying powers. His work in the resistance, while crucial, was only part of a larger struggle for Poland's independence. Throughout this period, Pilecki's emotional and psychological burdens continued to grow. The horrors he had witnessed inside Auschwitz haunted him, and his role in exposing the truth about the genocide weighed heavily on him. He had done everything in his power to alert the world, but the battle to bring the full extent of the Holocaust to light was far from over. His time in Auschwitz had shaped him in ways that were difficult to articulate. The deep scars of his experience remained with him, yet his commitment to the cause never wavered. He had sacrificed everything for the truth, and his story, while largely unknown at the time, would come to be seen as one of the greatest acts of heroism in the history of World War II. Witold Pilecki's journey was one of unyielding perseverance. His efforts to expose the atrocities of Auschwitz, despite the indifference, skepticism, and danger that surrounded him, have made him a symbol of courage and moral clarity in the face of evil. His unwavering commitment to the truth, even when it seemed that no one would listen, left an indelible mark on history. Witold Pilecki's experience in the aftermath of his escape from Auschwitz was one of intense resilience and determination, as he shifted from a prisoner and resistance fighter to a vital witness of the Holocaust. Despite the fact that he had exposed the scale of the atrocities within Auschwitz, the struggle to raise international awareness and force meaningful action remained an uphill battle. The political landscape in which Pilecki found himself was complex and fraught with uncertainty. The world, particularly the Western Allies, had yet to fully comprehend the magnitude of the genocide being perpetrated by the Nazis. For Pilecki, the fight to convince the international community of the Holocaust scale was just as crucial as his efforts to resist from within the camp. But the task he faced was far from easy. His reports were groundbreaking and detailed, yet many in positions of power were either skeptical of the information or dismissive of its importance. After his escape, Pilecki immediately turned his focus to the Polish government in exile, delivering detailed reports on the horrors he had witnessed at Auschwitz. These reports were essential, offering first-hand accounts of the conditions inside the camp and of the systematic extermination of Jews, Romani people, and others deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime. They described in chilling detail the methodical use of gas chambers, the crematoria, and the daily executions. Pilecki's first-hand knowledge of the camp's operations gave the reports a sense of authenticity that was unprecedented. He made it clear that Auschwitz was not merely a concentration camp, but a death machine that was actively engaged in mass murder on an industrial scale. The evidence he presented was undeniable, and yet many of those in positions of power, especially in the Western world, were slow to take action. One of the primary reasons for this reluctance was the sheer scale of the information Pilecki was presenting. The idea of mass extermination was still largely unfathomable to most people in the Allied countries. The Nazis had become experts at obfuscating the truth, hiding their crimes behind layers of bureaucracy and misinformation. Even when Pilecki's reports made their way to the Allies, they were often met with skepticism. The thought that millions of people were being systematically murdered seemed like a narrative too horrible to believe. The Western Allies, focused on defeating Nazi Germany, were at first hesitant to divert military resources to help the victims of the genocide. Some even questioned whether Pilecki's accounts were exaggerated or misinterpreted. It was a chilling reflection of the extent to which the world had become desensitized to the unimaginable suffering occurring in occupied Europe. In the months following his escape, Pilecki worked tirelessly to spread the information he had gathered, but he was often confronted with indifference and disbelief. His frustration with the international community grew as he realized that, despite the overwhelming evidence, many people were still not ready to acknowledge the extent of the horrors being perpetrated by the Nazis. For Pilecki, this was not just an issue of military strategy or diplomatic relations. It was a moral imperative. He knew that if the world did not respond to the Holocaust with urgency, millions more would die. His reports were crucial, but they were only part of the puzzle. The real challenge lay in convincing the Allies to take the necessary steps to stop the genocide. The lack of immediate action by the Allies left Pilecki feeling disillusioned. His mission to alert the world to the truth about Auschwitz and the other death camps had been met with resistance at every turn. Yet, despite these setbacks, he did not give up. The war was still ongoing, and every effort he made could still contribute to the eventual defeat of the Nazi regime. He continued to work with the Polish resistance, gathering more intelligence, coordinating efforts to sabotage the Nazi war machine, and offering guidance to those still trapped inside the death camps. He also continued to report on the activities of the Nazis, gathering information that could aid the Allies in their strategic planning. The emotional weight of Pilecki's mission continued to take a toll on him. He had seen things that no human being should ever witness: the systematic annihilation of innocent people, the crushing of human dignity, and the horrors of mass murder. Yet, he never lost his sense of responsibility. He was a man with a deep moral compass, and he felt that it was his duty to ensure that the world did not forget the lessons of Auschwitz. He also understood that history would be the judge of his actions. The price of truth was high, and the cost of indifference was far higher. By 1944, the Allied forces had begun to make significant progress in their war against Nazi Germany. However, the battle for Poland was far from over. While the Allies had liberated many territories in Western Europe, Poland remained under the control of the German and Soviet forces. The fate of the Polish people was uncertain, and Pilecki remained deeply concerned about their future. The Soviet Union had its own plans for Eastern Europe, and many feared that, after the war, Poland would fall under Soviet influence. Pilecki's commitment to Polish independence remained unwavering, even as he continued his work within the resistance. As the war reached its climax, Pilecki's work in the resistance became more perilous. The Nazis, realizing that the war was turning against them, began to lash out with increasing violence. The Polish resistance faced an even more brutal crackdown, and Pilecki knew that his time was running out. Despite the growing dangers, he refused to back down. His conviction and belief in the cause of Polish independence remained as strong as ever, and he continued to fight for the freedom of his countrymen, even as the world began to slowly acknowledge the reality of the Holocaust. In 1945, as the war in Europe finally came to a close, Pilecki's world was irrevocably altered. The Nazis had been defeated, but the war's end did not bring the freedom that Pilecki had hoped for. The Soviet Union, which had advanced through Eastern Europe, now occupied Poland. The hopes of the Polish resistance for an independent, democratic Poland were dashed as the Soviet regime established a puppet government. The reality of this new occupation forced Pilecki to confront a grim truth. The struggle for Polish independence was not over, but it had taken on a new and insidious form. The Soviet regime posed a different kind of threat, one that would shape the political future of Eastern Europe for decades to come. In the face of this new challenge, Pilecki refused to relent. His unwavering commitment to the principles of freedom, democracy, and justice drove him to continue his work as a resistance fighter. He became an outspoken critic of the Soviet occupation, and he once again found himself fighting for his country's freedom. But this time, the fight would not be against Nazi oppressors. It would be against the totalitarian regime of the Soviets, who sought to impose their own vision of governance on Poland. Despite the efforts of the Soviet-backed regime to silence him, Pilecki remained determined to continue his fight. His participation in the underground resistance and his ongoing advocacy for Polish independence led to his eventual capture by the communist authorities in 1947. Pilecki was arrested, tortured, and eventually sentenced to death by the Soviet regime. His refusal to abandon his ideals, even in the face of brutal interrogation and the threat of execution, exemplified the unyielding strength of his character. On May 25, 1948, Witold Pilecki was executed by the communist government in Poland. He died a martyr to the cause of Polish freedom, his unwavering commitment to the truth, the dignity of the oppressed, and the independence of his homeland never wavering until the end. The world would not fully recognize his heroism for many years, but his actions, his willingness to endure unspeakable hardships, to risk everything in the pursuit of justice, and to fight against both Nazi and Soviet oppression, would eventually be acknowledged. Witold Pilecki's legacy is one of immense courage, selflessness, and moral clarity. His efforts to expose the Holocaust, his willingness to sacrifice himself for the greater good, and his unrelenting pursuit of justice make him one of the most extraordinary figures of World War II. He lived and died for the truth, and in doing so, became a symbol of the very ideals that the forces of tyranny sought to destroy. His story is not just one of resistance to Nazi oppression, but of an unwavering commitment to human dignity, freedom, and justice, values that transcend time and continue to inspire those who fight for a better world. Witold Pilecki's journey was far from linear, and his time in the underground resistance after his escape from Auschwitz marked a continued phase of sacrifice, both personal and political. In the midst of the chaos and uncertainty that gripped Poland in the final years of World War II, Pilecki's resolve to fight for his country's freedom never faltered. Despite the relentless pressures that came with the ongoing war and the political situation in Poland, he remained committed to the values that had defined his entire life: patriotism, loyalty, and the belief that the truth must be known, no matter the cost. In the aftermath of the war, as the Nazi regime began to crumble, the situation in Poland was far from clear. Poland was caught between two opposing powers: the advancing Soviet army from the east and the remnants of the Nazi occupation forces, who were still retreating to the west. The Allied powers, having focused on defeating Nazi Germany, began to shift their attention away from Eastern Europe, leaving the Polish people to grapple with the uncertainty of what the future would hold. For Pilecki, the end of the war was not a moment of victory, but rather one of bitter realization. The freedom he had fought for, the freedom he had envisioned for his country, was not yet secured. Instead, Poland found itself once again under the control of foreign powers. With the Soviet Union now firmly entrenched in Poland, Pilecki realized that the fight for Polish independence had only just begun. The new threat was not the Nazis, but the communist regime that was rapidly taking control of Eastern Europe. The Soviet-backed government in Poland sought to impose a totalitarian system that was far removed from the democratic ideals that the Polish resistance had fought for during the war. While the Nazis had been defeated, Poland's future remained uncertain, and Pilecki found himself confronted by a new and insidious form of oppression. Though the horrors of Auschwitz were now widely known, Pilecki's fight for freedom had to extend beyond just the defeat of Nazi Germany. Now, he faced a new battle: the struggle to preserve Polish sovereignty and independence in the face of Soviet domination. Determined not to let Poland fall under the control of another totalitarian regime, Pilecki returned to the underground resistance movement, this time opposing the communist forces that sought to dominate Poland's future. But this was a different kind of struggle. The Soviets had a different set of tactics and a far-reaching network of spies and informants, making it increasingly difficult for resistance groups to operate effectively. Pilecki understood that the fight for Polish freedom had become a much more complex and dangerous mission. The enemy was no longer a foreign occupying force. It was a political system that had become embedded in the very fabric of Polish society. Pilecki was committed to the cause of Polish independence, and his experience in Auschwitz had only strengthened his belief in the necessity of freedom and self-determination for the Polish people. He could not stand idly by while another foreign power sought to impose its will upon his country. The lessons learned in the fight against Nazi oppression now served as the foundation for his resistance against the communist regime. However, this resistance would not come without enormous personal costs. The Soviet-backed government, with its increasing control over the country, was now bent on stamping out any opposition, and Pilecki knew that he was now a marked man. His work as a resistance fighter during the Nazi occupation had already earned him the ire of the Gestapo. Now, his efforts to resist Soviet oppression made him a target for the Soviet-backed authorities. With the war's end, Pilecki did not simply transition back into civilian life. Instead, he remained deeply involved in the underground network, attempting to organize and coordinate resistance activities against the new Soviet-backed government. He worked tirelessly to keep the flame of Polish independence alive, seeking to build alliances with others who still believed in the possibility of a free Poland. But the landscape had changed. The Soviet presence in Poland was overwhelming, and the Polish resistance movement was far less organized and fragmented. What had been a united front against the Nazis was now splintered into different factions, each with their own vision for Poland's future. Pilecki, however, remained steadfast in his belief that a free and independent Poland, one that was not a pawn of either the Nazis or the Soviets, was still possible. His determination to see this vision fulfilled, even in the face of overwhelming adversity, drove him forward. As he worked within the resistance, Pilecki was forced to deal with the increasing infiltration of Soviet intelligence operatives and the growing network of informants who worked for the communist authorities. His movements were now more restricted, and he could no longer operate as freely as he had during the war. The Soviet-backed regime had a far-reaching surveillance network, and Pilecki was well aware that at any moment he could be caught and punished. Yet, despite these ever-present dangers, he pressed on, unwilling to give up on the cause that had defined his life. In 1947, Pilecki's worst fears were realized when he was betrayed and captured by the Soviet-backed secret police. The price of resistance in a country under totalitarian rule was steep, and Pilecki found himself subjected to brutal interrogation and torture. The Soviets, determined to root out any opposition to their rule, sought to break Pilecki and extract information from him. Despite the unrelenting torture he endured, Pilecki did not yield. His unwavering commitment to the cause of Polish independence remained unshaken. He refused to betray his fellow resistance fighters or reveal any information that could jeopardize the future of the resistance. His loyalty to Poland and to the principles of freedom and justice that had guided him throughout his life sustained him in these dark moments. Despite his unbroken spirit, the Soviet authorities were determined to make an example of Pilecki. He was sentenced to death for his role in the resistance, and his execution was seen as a way to intimidate others who might dare to challenge the Soviet-backed regime. The trial was a farce, a show trial designed to silence one of the most significant figures in the Polish resistance movement. Pilecki's courage and steadfastness in the face of this injustice only highlighted the stark contrast between his ideals and the brutal tactics of the Soviet regime. On May 25, 1948, Witold Pilecki was executed by the Soviet-backed government of Poland. His death marked the tragic end of a life devoted to the cause of freedom and justice. He was 47 years old. Pilecki's execution, however, did not mark the end of his legacy. In the years following his death, Pilecki's heroism and commitment to the truth would eventually be recognized, though only much later. The Polish people and the world would come to understand the depth of his sacrifice and the extraordinary courage he had shown in the face of both Nazi and Soviet tyranny. Witold Pilecki's life and legacy are a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the enduring power of conviction. His commitment to the truth, his unwavering dedication to the freedom of his country, and his willingness to sacrifice everything for the greater good make him one of the most remarkable figures of the 20th century. He did not seek fame or recognition. He sought only to protect his country and expose the truth about the suffering that millions of people endured during World War II. His actions, both during the war and in the post-war resistance, have become a symbol of the struggle for freedom, human dignity, and justice. Though Pilecki's death came in the shadows of Soviet oppression, his legacy continues to inspire those who fight for human rights and political freedom. His story is one of extraordinary courage in the face of unimaginable adversity, a reminder of the importance of standing up for what is right, no matter the cost. Pilecki's refusal to submit to tyranny, whether under Nazi or Soviet rule, marks him as one of the greatest unsung heroes of the 20th century, whose impact on history will never be forgotten. Witold Pilecki's enduring legacy as one of the most remarkable figures in the history of World War II is defined by his courage, selflessness, and unwavering commitment to the fight for freedom. However, his story remains one that was largely obscured for decades. After the war ended and the focus of global politics shifted, particularly in the context of the Cold War and Soviet control over Eastern Europe, Pilecki's actions were forgotten or, at best, overshadowed by the more widely known narratives of other wartime heroes. His resistance against both Nazi and Soviet oppression was an extraordinary act of heroism, but for many years, it remained hidden in the shadows of history. When Pilecki entered Auschwitz as a volunteer, he did so with an extraordinary sense of duty. His mission was clear: to gather intelligence from within the camp and help organize a resistance movement inside Auschwitz. His decision was rooted in the belief that the world needed to understand the scope of the atrocities being committed by the Nazis. What Pilecki did not anticipate was the sheer magnitude of the horror he would witness firsthand. The horrors of the Holocaust, the industrialized genocide, were far beyond anything he could have prepared for. But despite the brutality of the camp and the unimaginable suffering he saw daily, he never wavered from his mission. Pilecki's determination to resist the Nazis and expose their atrocities was a direct result of his deeply held moral principles and sense of responsibility. Upon his escape from Auschwitz, Pilecki knew that his task was far from complete. He carried with him crucial information about the workings of the camp, the systematic extermination of Jews and other marginalized groups, and the operations of the Nazi regime. His first-hand accounts were vital pieces of evidence that could help end the Holocaust and, in the longer term, expose the full extent of Nazi crimes. But Pilecki's struggle was not only against the Nazis. His fight continued against the Soviet-backed communist regime that soon occupied Poland after the war. Though the Nazis were defeated, the political landscape in Eastern Europe was in turmoil. The Soviet Union moved swiftly to exert its control over Poland, and the dreams of an independent, democratic Poland began to fade as the country fell under communist rule. For Pilecki, this new form of totalitarianism was just as dangerous as the Nazi occupation. He had fought to free Poland from one tyrannical regime, only to find his country under the thumb of another. The resistance movements that had flourished during the war were now faced with a new adversary, one that used its vast intelligence network to crush any opposition. In these post-war years, Pilecki was faced with a political reality he had not fully anticipated when he first volunteered to infiltrate Auschwitz. He had envisioned a Poland that was free of both Nazi and Soviet oppression, a country where citizens could determine their own future. But with Soviet control in place, this vision seemed increasingly impossible. Pilecki returned to the underground resistance, not to fight the Nazis, but to oppose the new communist regime. His commitment to Polish independence never wavered, but the struggle now took on a different character. The challenges were monumental. The Soviet regime was ruthless, far-reaching in its control, and quick to label anyone who opposed it as a traitor. Pilecki, as a key figure in the resistance during the war, was now an important target for Soviet authorities. Despite the constant danger he faced, Pilecki remained deeply involved in efforts to preserve Poland's sovereignty. His role was no longer just that of a resistance fighter. It became one of a strategist, a guide to others fighting for the same ideals. Yet, Pilecki was not fighting alone. He continued to work within a fragmented resistance network, navigating the increasingly treacherous political landscape. At the same time, his disillusionment with the inability of the Allies to fully intervene in Eastern Europe grew. He had spent years gathering vital intelligence about the Nazis, trying to alert the world to the Holocaust. But now, he found himself confronting a new form of indifference, the apathy of the international community toward the fate of Eastern Europe. Pilecki's role as an intelligence officer within the Polish underground had been crucial during the war, but in the years after, his efforts became focused on the political survival of Poland and its people. The Soviets had moved quickly to assert their dominance, and the communist regime soon became entrenched in Polish society, making any sort of organized resistance exceedingly dangerous. The key question for Pilecki was whether Poland could ever truly be free from foreign domination. He had seen how the war had fractured the country and its people, and he realized that any hope for a free Poland would be a long and difficult road. The political climate in Poland had become even more volatile after the war. In addition to Soviet pressure, Poland's post-war government, established under Soviet influence, worked diligently to erase any traces of Polish independence or resistance to the new regime. This political transformation had been well orchestrated by the Soviets, who used both propaganda and brutal repression to crush any dissent. The Polish Communist Party worked tirelessly to eliminate potential threats, and Pilecki, as one of the most prominent members of the wartime resistance, was quickly singled out by Soviet-backed authorities as a dangerous adversary. Despite the risks, Pilecki remained determined to continue his fight. He could not accept a Poland that had fallen into the hands of foreign occupiers once again. His understanding of the importance of moral resistance, of standing firm against tyranny, shaped his determination. He worked tirelessly within the underground, attempting to build an alternative vision for Poland's future. However, his efforts were met with increasing obstacles. As a key figure in the resistance, Pilecki had become a highly sought-after target, and in 1947, he was arrested by the secret police. The arrest was the culmination of years of efforts by the Soviet-backed government to neutralize potential threats. Pilecki was taken into custody and subjected to intense interrogation and torture. The goal was simple: break him, force him to confess to crimes against the state, and destroy the last vestiges of resistance. The interrogations were brutal. Pilecki was subjected to beatings, psychological abuse, and physical torment in an attempt to force him into submission. Yet, despite the overwhelming pressure, Pilecki refused to betray his comrades or provide any information that could compromise the future of the resistance movement. Pilecki's unbreakable spirit, even under the most extreme duress, is a testament to his extraordinary character. He never wavered in his convictions. He was a man whose sense of duty, loyalty, and responsibility toward his country remained steadfast, even in the face of almost unimaginable suffering. His refusal to cooperate with the Soviet-backed authorities was a reflection of his deep commitment to Polish freedom and independence, even as the political landscape grew increasingly bleak. Pilecki's trial was a farce, a mockery of justice. The Soviet-backed authorities, intent on making an example of him, charged him with treason and other fabricated crimes. It was a predetermined process. The outcome had already been decided. The trial, which lasted only a few days, was little more than a political theater designed to legitimize the execution of a man who had become a symbol of resistance against both Nazi and Soviet oppression. On May 25, 1948, Witold Pilecki was executed by the Polish communist regime. His death marked the tragic and unjust end of a life dedicated to the cause of freedom, justice, and the preservation of Poland's sovereignty. The legacy of his courage, however, did not end with his death. In the decades that followed, as the communist regime in Poland began to unravel and the truth about the atrocities of the Soviet system came to light, Pilecki's actions became recognized for their extraordinary heroism. He had not only fought to expose the truth about Auschwitz and the Holocaust, but he had also resisted the imposition of Soviet totalitarianism on his country. For many years, Pilecki's name was largely forgotten, buried beneath the weight of Soviet oppression and the political struggles of the Cold War. However, in the years following the fall of communism in Poland, his legacy began to be rediscovered. Pilecki was posthumously exonerated, and his story began to emerge as one of the most extraordinary tales of resistance in the 20th century. His commitment to the truth, his ability to resist two of the most powerful totalitarian regimes in history, and his unwavering belief in the cause of Polish independence have ensured that his name will never be forgotten again. Witold Pilecki is remembered today not just as a hero of World War II, but as a symbol of the enduring power of human dignity, resistance, and the fight for freedom, no matter the odds. Witold Pilecki's story is often described as one of exceptional courage, resilience, and moral clarity. His decision to voluntarily enter Auschwitz, not as a prisoner but as a spy, was a unique act of bravery that set him apart from others who fought against Nazi oppression. Pilecki was driven not by the desire for personal glory, but by an unwavering commitment to the truth and a deep sense of responsibility for his homeland. His actions within the camp and after his escape reveal a man who was willing to sacrifice everything to expose the horrors of the Holocaust and fight for the freedom of Poland. Yet, as the years passed, Pilecki's name largely disappeared from the historical narrative. Despite his extraordinary role in both the resistance against the Nazis and the subsequent fight against Soviet domination, his contributions remained largely unknown for decades. After his escape from Auschwitz, Pilecki's mission had just begun. He was not only a survivor of one of the most brutal and inhumane systems ever created by mankind, but he had also become one of the world's first eyewitnesses to the horrors of the Holocaust. The information he carried with him was not just personal testimony, but also vital intelligence that could potentially alter the course of the war. His detailed reports about Auschwitz, written under the most extreme conditions, were among the earliest, most comprehensive accounts of the systematic extermination of Jews and others at the hands of the Nazis. Yet, despite the urgency of his mission, Pilecki soon realized that the path ahead would be fraught with challenges, both personal and political. Pilecki's reports were shocking in their detail. He described, with grim accuracy, the operations of the camp, the construction of gas chambers, and the mass executions of Jews, Romani people, and other groups the Nazis deemed undesirable. His descriptions were not simply of physical suffering, but of a dehumanizing machinery of murder, which operated with cold efficiency. But the real difficulty lay in convincing the outside world to believe him. The scale of the genocide he was describing was so vast, so horrifying, that even those who received his intelligence were reluctant to accept its truth. Many in the Polish resistance were skeptical at first, struggling to believe that the Nazi regime could carry out such an unimaginable atrocity. But it wasn't just the resistance that was slow to react. Even the Allies, despite mounting evidence of atrocities in occupied Europe, were unwilling to commit to action. For Pilecki, this posed a critical dilemma. He had risked his life to gather evidence, and yet the world seemed indifferent to the horror he had so painstakingly documented. The Allies, focused on military strategy and the defeat of Nazi Germany, were initially reluctant to intervene to stop the mass extermination taking place in the concentration camps. Even when they acknowledged the existence of camps like Auschwitz, the reality of the Holocaust was so far beyond what many could fathom that it was dismissed as propaganda or exaggerated reports. The lack of urgency in response to Pilecki's intelligence was a source of profound frustration for him. He could not understand how the world could remain passive in the face of such clear evidence of genocide. The failure of the international community to act on his reports left him feeling isolated and helpless, but his commitment to exposing the truth never wavered. Pilecki's role in the Polish underground resistance during the war was also critical in helping to undermine Nazi control in Poland. While imprisoned in Auschwitz, Pilecki managed to organize an underground resistance movement within the camp, which operated in the shadows, defying the oppressive regime that sought to dehumanize and destroy its prisoners. This internal resistance, called Związek Organizacji Wojskowych (ZOW), was dedicated to sabotaging the Nazi war effort and to gathering intelligence on the workings of the camp. Despite the severe limitations placed on him as a prisoner, Pilecki's organizational skills and leadership qualities allowed him to build a network that kept hope alive within Auschwitz, even in the darkest moments. His ability to mobilize fellow prisoners and orchestrate acts of defiance was a testament to his extraordinary leadership and unyielding determination. After his escape, Pilecki rejoined the Polish resistance outside the camp. But the landscape had changed. Poland was now under the control of both Nazi Germany and the advancing Soviet forces. The fight for Polish independence was now twofold: to liberate the country from the Nazis and prevent it from falling under Soviet domination. Pilecki's vision for Poland's future remained the same: a free, independent, and democratic Poland. But the circumstances had shifted dramatically. The Soviets, advancing westward, were beginning to impose their own totalitarian regime, and the Polish people were caught between the hammer of Nazi oppression and the anvil of Soviet control. Pilecki recognized that his struggle was no longer just about defeating the Nazis. It was about preventing Poland from falling under the yoke of another totalitarian regime. The post-war years were characterized by a growing sense of disillusionment for Pilecki. Despite his dedication to the cause, the geopolitical realities of the time seemed to work against him. While Poland had been freed from Nazi control, the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe made it increasingly difficult for the Polish resistance to continue its work. The rise of the Soviet-backed government in Poland posed a new challenge, one that was not as easily understood by the international community as the fight against the Nazis. The West, still largely focused on rebuilding after the war and containing Soviet influence, was slow to acknowledge the scale of the threat posed by the Soviet occupation of Poland and other Eastern European countries.